Good day. Welcome to the Great White North. I'm Gord Fessick, and I seem to be without my pets today, so it's finally going to be my topic. And my topic today is not this gorgeous IBM 5150, but instead this busted and extremely yellowed Commodore 128. This machine belongs to Daryl Krantz over in La Crosse, and we're going to do Extreme Retrobright 2 Electric Boogaloo. We're going to get this thing better, and we'll improve on the techniques that we used compared to the first C128 that I did. I also have a spare Commodore 128 keyboard that we're going to retrobright as well, and we're going to show some nice new tools for getting that done. And speaking of such, let's get her done. On my previous attempt, I ended up marbling this case a bit here. There's streaks here and splotches and so forth. The top half is a little bit brighter than the bottom half. Last time I did a Retrobright project, I used a clear coat, which was a significant percentage of acetone, which actually took off some of these splotches from the case. So I'm going to see if I can replicate that effect on this machine here. This is my good working 128 that I got from Roadkill Incorporated. Here's the other one. It is missing all of its case screws, so I had to replace them with PC case screws for now. All of these RAM caps and some of the logic ICs had caps which were snapped in half, or in some cases the tops were sheared off. I have no idea why that was the case. These are some of the caps that I replaced. These are lower profile caps, so that shearing should never happen again. When I used my working 128 to test some of the chips, I found that all the ones I pulled were working. I started with the VIC-2E and that was fine. And I'm like, was the VDC installed backwards on Daryl's machine? It must have been. The 6502 compatible and the Z80 here were also installed in opposite orientations of each other. Pin 1 is here on the 8502 and pin 1 is here on the Z80. I'm guessing that's to align the address and data lines. A very similar thing happened here in the video era where pin 1 of the VIC-2E was here, but pin 1 of the VDC was here. So I went, okay, let's put the VDC in with pin 1 facing up here, and shortly after that, this machine worked. You notice it's also missing a SID chip, but I've got a spare one of those. We'll get that installed here later on. And this IC is intentionally left blank. This is an expansion ROM space, where you could have software loaded into ROM. Some people have been able to hack GEOS onto one of these, but we're not going to do that here. This is the RF shield from it. The shield is in good shape, except for some unknown reason, when I install the shield, I don't get any power. I don't get any display. Nothing boots. I'm guessing that's because one of the coils or whatnot is exposed to bare metal and is shorting out. I already blew my regular 128 power supply, but the aftermarket power supply I have has a self-resetting fuse, so that seems to be fine. I'm going to see about taping the underside of this to prevent any accidental shorts, and we'll get all these corners taped up. We'll see if that fixes the problem. So here we go. You'll see a solution that I did for the RF shield in a bit. Let's get this out of its case first so we can begin cleaning it up and getting it ready for Retrobright. I have to watch that power LED because it's not held in place with any snaps or anything, so I'll just keep that set aside. Next, let's get this keyboard taken apart. I've got a proper key puller now, so I don't risk as much damaging these keys. You can see underneath there that keyboard is just filthy.
Getting that stabilizer out was a little bit difficult, but not impossible. There we go. I forgot that the 0 key had a stabilizer, and so when I pulled it out, I used way too much force, and I pulled out the snaps that held the stabilizer in place. I ended up having to abandon the stabilizer when I put this keyboard back together. The key still works, but you have to press it in the middle. I wound up giving Daryl the spare keyboard to take care of that. For that reason, and for other reasons as well that I'll explain near the end of the video. But I was a lot more careful with the return and enter keys as a consequence. Like from last time, this top row of keys uses key plungers that are very similar to that from a Commodore Plus 4. So the spare keyboard was missing a key, but I borrowed a key and spring from the Plus 4 keyboard spare that I have, so that I could at least make this keyboard whole. And I'm looking at this and I'm just trying to brush it off. It's just disgusting. There was no way I was getting that clean just with a brush, so off comes like a zillion screws. And there we go. I had already desoldered the locking keys, so that wasn't a problem there. Then I flipped this thing around to get all the plungers out. There we go. Poke a few of those plungers out. I didn't lose any plungers, so putting this thing back together was not a problem. On the spare keyboard, one of the plungers was busted. I ended up replacing it with one from my Plus 4 spare. The locking keys just kind of snap out without any significant force. There we go. Now I can do a thorough scrub of this keyboard frame. I ended up doing the exact same thing to the spare keyboard, and it was in much better shape after that. The keys also were very filthy on both key sets, so I gave them a good soak in here. While I was working on other things, these keys soaked in their containers, and then I cleaned each individual key when I was done. There's the key frame from Daryl's machine. Here's the spare key frame, and they're both looking like they're in much better shape. There's some rust spots on Daryl's frame, which was another reason why I ended up giving him the spare keyboard frame. Here I am cleaning the case, getting that gunk out, whatever that gunk was. Giving it a good thorough scrub. After I got the interior done, I put both halves of the case together so it was easier to clean the exterior of it. I used some alcohol to try to get some of the scuffs off. It took off some of it, but I had to use baking soda to remove the rest. Much like the same order as David Murray uses, once again, dish soap, alcohol, baking soda in that order, giving the whole surface a good scrub with baking soda to give the Retrobright process a fighting chance. I also should have removed that label. That came back to haunt me when I was done, and you'll see how later on. If you take a look here, these are some shadows that the keys left while this thing was exposed to sunlight. That's how you can tell that sunlight affected this machine and not some other thing. Now, I ended up using plastic wrap and peroxide cream this time. I was expecting marbling to happen, much like what happened to David Murray's Osborne 1, so I was planning for that accordingly. I really wanted to give this a nice strong treatment That's 12% peroxide cream there, much like you can find in salons, and I was able to find it on Amazon, so I didn't have to go to Walmart anymore for the 35% stuff. This sat under the UV light for 3 days. 12 hours one day, another 8 hours the next day, and only a few hours afterward. Here's after day 2. It's better, but I don't believe it's quite done yet. So back under the light it goes. Next come the keys. Now that they've had a good soak in soap and water, I wiped off each of these keys individually. That still left some dirty water on them, but after I was done, I gave them a rinse, and they came out in much better shape after the rinse. Like I've explained before, if you get an old computer like this, take a moment to clean it up. You don't know what kind of germs or other kind of gunk is in there, and you should really only have to do this once, as long as you take good care of the machine after you're done. Next, let's deal with that RF shield. While the Retrobright process is going on, I focused my attention on dealing with this. I didn't know what was causing the short on the RF shield, so I covered as much of the interior exposed metal as I practically could with this vinyl tape. Even tried to wrap around the edges of the cartridge port and other edges of the RF shield. I used my old soldering iron to burn holes in all these vent holes. I also cut away the area around that screw hole near the top left, because that's where it mates with the RF shield of the video section, so I was able to make sure there was thermal contact between the main RF shield and the video RF shield when I was done. Next, let's give this modified RF shield a bit of a test fit. I also wrapped tape around that coil there. My 128 had some kind of fabric tape wrapped around it already, so I'm assuming that's supposed to be there in the factory. And look at that. Now we're working. Now that this keyframe is cleaned up, I put all the key plungers back. On the spare keyboard, again, I used a spare plunger from my +4 keyboard. There's the spacebar plunger, all done. Next comes the circuit board, which I gave a dry wipe before putting it back on here. You'll notice that I had the 4080 switch leads soldered together so I could do some testing. I didn't have a composite monitor handy, so I ended up using my IBM CGA monitor for the testing here. Having done this on 2 different keyboards now, I'm kind of tired of tiny little screws, but it had to be done. Both of these keyboards were filthy. Next, let's get to retrobrighting the keys. I had a Retrobright keyframe 3D printed, but the keys wouldn't fit on it, at least not initially. So I ended up using this tray here and another tray to do the other set of keys. And I did much the same thing, wrapped in peroxide cream in a relatively airtight plastic wrap, and left them under the lights with the case. Now this is day 3, and I finally got this case cleaned to the point where I think it was done. The only thing is, I probably should have rinsed it off in the slop sink downstairs because me scrubbing ruined that label. Oh no. Daryl, sorry about that. Don't worry, I'm going to use the label from my 128 to replace it. But you notice there's like no yellowing left. So that may have taken a really long time, but now this case is almost perfect. Take a closer look here. Aside from the marbling on my case, I don't know if you can tell the difference between Daryl's case and mine. Where it's not marbled, it's almost an exact match. Now let's get the keys out. I triple rinsed these, putting them in a container, ran them through water 3 times. I wanted to get all the peroxide off of there. So what I did with that container, I did 3 times to make sure I got all the peroxide off of there. These keys also had to go back in for 3 days to get completely de-yellowed. That took a long time. This is only the end of day 1, and it's already a significant improvement, but I don't believe it's enough yet. Now this is day 4, and we've got all the keys and the cases out. We're going to use our clear coat. This is matte finish Krylon clear coat, just like I used on the Atari 800, the previous episode. And I'm using it on all of the keys, not just the ones that I finished retrobrighting. I did manage to fit some of the keys on that 3D printed keyframe, but hey, look at what the clear coat did. It completely removed the marbling from my case. Nice. And there we go. Now you can hardly tell the difference between the two of them. Well, let's get these keyboards back together. I'm pretty sure, yeah, this was the original keyboard that I couldn't get the 0-key stabilizer working right on. I ended up giving up on that and just letting him have the spare keyboard, not just because of that, but because of the rust on here. And, well, it was just simpler to do that. The 2 keyboard matrices are identical between the spare keyboard and this one, even though the spare keyboard has some Cyrillic keys on it. In fact, the caps lock key actually switches between an ASCII keyboard and a Cyrillic keyboard. This here is using the spare keyboard set, and I have that clear home key. That's actually an Alt key on a Commodore 128. I ended up grabbing that one from my +4 spare set. I went and fished out that stabilizer under the 0 key on the keypad later on. And finally, the Commodore key. With a working keyboard, we get Daryl's computer back together. After sorting out all the remaining problems with the RF shield and taping up anything that might have touched on an exposed trace, we get this thing in here. I ended up using PC case screws for the computer itself, but I did use the original screws for this keyboard onto the top half of the case. And I had to get the top right corner of that. There we go. Otherwise, that LED would keep falling out on me. Just like my 128, there's a plastic bit that braces the LED against the keyboard. But once the keyboard's fastened into place, I can then put that grounding screw in there, and I can attach the 25-pin connector for the keyboard itself. It takes a bit of effort to line up the case pieces properly, but it does fit. And there we go. let's put the good label on here. I ended up using double-sided tape instead of contact cement this time because that worked well enough for my 128. And there we go. There you go, Daryl. Your machine's all finished. Let's give it a test. And the replacement SID chip is working. Thank goodness. Here's a before shot of both his computer and mine with the splotching, his with the yellowing. And the after shot. Both of them are almost immaculate, except for my damaged label. I'm gonna get one 3D printed to replace mine. I'll figure that out.
Well, like the neighborhood outside right now, Daryl's Commodore 128 is as white as the driven snow. We were able to successfully get all the yellowing off of here. I was even able to Retrobright both his keyboard and the spare keyboard, although I wound up installing the spare keyboard in his machine. Try as I might, I just couldn't get all the keys working on here, even with issues with the RF shield shorting out on certain parts of the board, and even after taping up as much as I could, the L key stopped working on his keyboard. So I gave him the International keyboard. I could try to revisit this some other time. In the meantime, he's got a working machine again. Also, we learned that you can undo extreme Retrobright damage, like splotching or bleaching, with a bit of clear coat, because the acetone will slightly dissolve the top layer of plastic and expose the original color underneath. I might revisit that with the keys on my 128, or I may just swap the keys with the spare keyboard here. We'll see how that goes. Coming up this weekend and next weekend are the last two flea markets for 2025. And after that, March 1st, I will be in Green Bay at Collectorabilia in the Resh Expo. Hope to see you there. Until then, good day.